Chapter 11 is one of our longest chapters. This is divisions of the nervous system. Most of it is on the brain. We're also going to look at the spinal cord and the autonomic nervous system. And then our final chapter, 12, is for the senses. There's two structures within the central nervous system that we need to look at called meninges. These are the connective tissue coverings, and ventricles, which are spaces filled with cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF for short. And then we'll do brain, spinal cord, and peripheral in that order. In peripheral, we're going to look at nerve structure and a little more detail about what the branches of autonomic do. The first section, the overview, tells us about the major brain areas. In a lateral view, the main thing you see is the cerebrum. We take a sagittal section you'll be able to identify more. The diencephalon is a set of structures in the middle of the brain. You can't see it from a lateral view because the cerebrum covers it. The brain stem is a group of 3 structures that come down and connect to the spinal cord. You can see a little of it from the side. And then the cerebellum is in the lower back part of the brain. Cerebrum means brain, cerebellum means little brain. Diencephalon, cerebrum is Latin for brain, encephalon is Greek for brain. Diencephalon means 2 brains because if you could see it out by itself, it looks like kind of like 2 eggs stuck together. Here's our sagittal section. All this gray is the cerebrum. Gray with the pink outlining is cerebellum. This tan in the middle here is diencephalon. This, even though it's yellow, is part of the diencephalon. There's kind of a gap here, and from here down is the brainstem. We'll look at each of those in more detail later in the chapter and in lab. Gray and white matter we mentioned in the last chapter. Which one has myelin? White matter. In the central nervous system, here's where we find each of those. Gray matter is the inner portion of the spinal cord and brainstem. It has white matter surrounding it. When you go to the cerebrum and cerebellum, it's reversed. The gray matter is at the surface. We call it the cortex. The white matter is inside, and it's all kind of branched out, connecting to different parts of gray matter. And those are tracts. The surface parts of the spinal cord and brainstem also include tracts. The meninges are layers of membrane around the central nervous system. This is what the dorsal cavity has in place of the ventral cavity's serous membranes. They are easiest to see on a spinal cord section. I never seem to draw this symmetrically. So this is roughly what a cross-section of the spinal cord would look like. White matter around gray in the middle. The outermost layer of the meninges is the dura mater. Notice this is with only one T. It means mother rather than stuff, like gray matter and white matter have the two T's. Dura means tough. This is a dense outer layer that resists puncture and also helps hold the brain and spinal cord against the bones around it. Next one in is the arachnoid matter. What's an arachnid? A spider. The arachnoid matter has a thin epithelial layer against the dura mater and then a network of fibers. Okay, so it's called arachnoid because it has a web. And then the deepest layer is the pia mater. Pia means gentle. The pia mater follows the edges of the nerve tissue. So if there are these grooves in the spinal cord that the pia mater dips into, in the brain, all those bumps and grooves, the pia mater follows along them. And that's the main reason it's easier to draw the meninges on the spinal cord. The blood vessels, specifically the arteries that deliver the nutrients, are in the pia mater. The veins that take the wastes away are in the dura mater usually. In the spinal cord, there's an epidural space outside the dura mater, so epi, on or outside. So it's between the dura mater and the vertebrae. It contains adipose and areolar tissues and blood vessels, so it's kind of like the subcutaneous layer of the skin, where it connects the dura mater to the bones, but also provides additional padding. The brain does not have an epidural space. Instead, it has a double layer of dura, where the outer one is stuck to the skull, and between them are where you find the veins. There's also a subarachnoid space. That would be in here within the web. And that's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. That we have in both the brain and spinal cord. So here's a view of the meninges in the spinal column. You can see epidural fat here. Gray is the dura mater. Purple is arachnoid with a little blue for the fluid. And then pink is pia. Here in a cross section, you can see the epidural space more clearly. Again, gray for dura, and it blends into a sheath on the nerves that come out. So once you get to here-ish, yeah, I'd say about there, it's considered part of the nerve sheath rather than the dura mater. And then again, arachnoid, fluid, and pia, and this yellow is nerves. In the cranial cavity, we have the cranial meninges. On the close-up, we can see here's gray matter and white matter of the cerebrum. Pia right up against the gray matter. So our subarachnoid space, arachnoid matter, and then the dura mater. And this spot here is where it has some openings for large veins. Questions on meninges? Ventricles are 4 spaces in the brain that are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. There are two lateral ventricles. There is an official numbering where left or right is number 1, but I don't remember that. So just remember those together are lateral. They are within each hemisphere or half of the cerebrum. Then they come together and there's a third ventricle in the middle of the diencephalon. A channel comes down from that to the fourth ventricle, which is between the pons, a part of the brainstem, and cerebellum. In fact, I included the fourth ventricle here. It's this little triangle. Coming down from the fourth ventricle is another channel that goes into the spinal cord and forms what's called the central canal. So you have cerebrospinal fluid spread around inside within these ventricles and channels, and outside in the subarachnoid space. The ventricles are hard to show on a flat picture. This view is looking from the front, so you can see that the third and fourth ventricles are centered. The lateral ventricles are out to the side. Here's a side view where they've just shown all of it, but that makes it harder to tell what's closer to you, what's further away. I think it looks like a Dr. Seuss creature where the lateral ventricles are like horns or some kind of big hair. The third ventricle is the face. This little bump here is where the two sides of the diencephalon connect. And so it's kind of like a rock in the stream, and the ventricle is around it. And then long neck, and the fourth ventricle is the shoulders. Questions on ventricles? We'll be able to see them a little bit in the models today, more so in the sheep brains next week. So cerebral spinal fluid is both for circulation and padding. It circulates nutrients and removes the wastes. Cerebrospinal fluid will get processed back into the blood. One place it happens is those little clusters where the arachnoid matter sticks out into the vein. And the padding is especially in the subarachnoid space. Because of that webbing, it makes sure it stays equal thickness all around. So you have fluid surrounding the brain, top and bottom. This provides some protection if you get bumped, keeps things from jarring around. Plus, the brain only weighs about 3 pounds, but it's so delicate that its own 3 pounds would damage it if it were actually pressing against the skull. So the cerebrospinal fluid keeps it floating, keeps it safe. CSF is produced in areas called the choroid plexus. There's one in each ventricle, and it's a cluster of capillaries and ependyma. The ependyma take the right stuff out of the capillaries and secrete it into the ventricle. And then CSF is reabsorbed into the blood, taking the wastes with it. Questions on CSF? That takes us to the brain. We'll just do the beginning of brain structure. The first part of this section talks about brain development. You don't need to know any of that in detail. I'm going to mention the one thing, the neural tube is the first stage of developing the CNS in the embryo. That becomes the brain and spinal cord. If it doesn't form correctly, then there are disorders like spina bifida and anencephaly. They're called neural tube defects, where part of the spinal cord or the brain could be missing. So we start with the cerebrum. I mentioned the cortex, that's the gray matter at the surface. Cortex means rind, and Next semester in A&P2, you're going to see a lot more organs that have a cortex. The ridges are called gyri, singular is gyrus, and then the grooves are sulci, singular is sulcus. Really deep grooves are called fissures, like this one. And then the two halves are hemispheres, so there's a left and right hemisphere to your cerebrum. They're separated by the longitudinal fissure. But down inside the fissure, there's something called the corpus callosum that we'll see in another view that connects them together so they can communicate. So those are your basic cerebral structures. The color coding here is for lobes. Each hemisphere has a mirror image set of 5 lobes. 4 of them, the names should look familiar. If you remember your skull bones,